y quisiera pues presentarla. Marion, thank you for being with us today. It's an honor and a privilege to listen to you. And I invite you to start.
Gracias, Senora Francesca, for your kind and meaningful introduction. And gracias
por la introducción.
Senora Mauro and Selma, for giving me the opportunity to virtually visit that Anahuac students.
De estar en la Universidad Anáhuac.
I so wish that I could be with all of you in person.
Ella quisiera estar con todos nosotros en persona.
But since we still have this COVID in our midst,
pero por el hecho
we will use this amazing Zoom technology.
Usando la tecnología de Zoom para poderlo hacer.
I'm with you this morning to share my story.
Estoy con ustedes
para my childhood experiences,
historia de mi niñez.
Camps. I will tell you about our liberation.
Les hablé de la liberación.
How we finally started our lives anew.
Y de cómo empezamos nuestras vidas en Nueva York, en los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica.
Mine is a story that Anne Frank might have told.
Mi vida es una historia que quizá Ana Frank hubiera contado.
This is also a story that conveys a message.
Eso también es una historia de perseverancia,
determination,
de determinación,
faith,
fe,
and above all, hope.
Y sobre todo de esperanza.
After the presentation, I will be pleased to answer some of your questions.
Después de la presentación podrá contestar algunas de nuestras preguntas.
Francesca, I can hear your translation. Is that the way it's supposed to be?
I hope not. ¿Podríamos hacer algo para que ella no escuchara la traducción, por favor? Y que yo nada más la escuchara a ella.
I can hear the translation. If it has to be that way, Francesca, then so be it.
Yes, my dear, just let the technician take care of it. Si puedes quitar que me escuche ella, por favor.
En el chat, Francesca, están pidiendo que no traduzca los alumnos, que solo hable Marion. Entonces, deja que hable Marion y ya veremos.
I'm going to stop translating because the students have requested my stop translating. So you go ahead and do your thing, okay?
Thank you. Thank you. Gracias for everything and for making this visit possible, each and every one of you in charge. Life in the early, should I start at the very beginning? At the, whatever I want to do. Okay. I would like to thank Senora Francesca and Senora Mauro and Selma for giving me the opportunity to speak to virtually with you, the students of Universidad Anahuac. I so wish that I could be with all of you in person, but since we still have this COVID in our midst, we are grateful to have this Zoom technology to connect with one another. I'm with you this morning to share my story. It is my childhood experiences during World War II in the concentration camps. I will tell you about our liberation and how we finally started our lives anew in the United States of America. Mine is a story that Anne Frank might have told had she survived. This is also a story that conveys a message of perseverance, determination, faith, and above all, hope. After the presentation, I will be pleased to answer some of your questions. Life in the early 1930s in Germany was very much for my family, as it is here for most of you today. Never did we think that the anti-Semitic incidents there would ever lead to very much. My father was in a successful shoe business in a small town. My parents, 2-year older brother, and I lived comfortably with my grandparents above the shoe store. Life for Jews was made increasingly more difficult, and in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were formulated and enforced. The following are just some of the many restrictions imposed on the Jews in Germany. Jews were not allowed into theaters, into parks, or into swimming pools. All public schools were closed to Jewish children. Then there was an evening curfew for the Jews. Jews were only allowed to shop during specific hours of the day, and non-Jews were not allowed to shop in Jewish-owned stores. Non-Jews were just not allowed to associate with Jewish people. And then a big letter J for Jew was stamped on ID cards and on passports. These restrictions went on, and it was then that my parents decided to make arrangements to leave the country. My grandparents, who in the late 70s and ill, refused to leave their home. They could not understand the urgency or the necessity of doing so. My grandparents passed away in 1938, just 11 days within each other. And soon thereafter, we received our necessary papers for our immigration to America. I was just 4 years old at that time. November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night. It was the night of broken glass, when the Nazis and their many followers smashed the windows and the storefronts of Jewish-owned stores. Jewish establishments, synagogues, and Jewish books were burned and destroyed. This was the beginning of a massive pogrom against the Jews in Germany, a massive verbal and physical assault against all German Jews. In reality, this was the beginning of the Holocaust. On November 12th, following Kristallnacht, the German government actually fined the Jewish population for the damage caused that night. These imposed taxes were used to rearm Germany. The night of Kristallnacht, our apartment was ransacked. All valuables were thrown into a pillowcase and taken away. But worst of all was that they transported my father to concentration camp Buchenwald in Germany. All sorts of terrible stories were related to my mother, and we did not know if we would ever see my father again. He was released after 3 weeks only because our papers were in order for our immigration to America. And to think that just a few years prior, he had been awarded the Iron Cross for his military service in the German army of World War I. We were forced to sell both our home and our business for a fraction of its worth. And soon thereafter, in January of 1939, we left for Holland, from where we were to sail to the United States. And for almost 9 months, while awaiting our quota number from the American State Department, my parents were assigned to take care of some 125 children. These young children had been sent by their parents from various parts of Europe to escape from the Nazis. In December of that year, 1939, we were deported to the detention camp of Westerbork in Holland to await our departure date to America. Camp Westerbork was constructed by the Dutch to accommodate Jews from various parts of Europe. In May of 1940, just 1 month before our planned departure date, the Germans invaded Holland and we were trapped. All of our belongings, which were about to be loaded on board ship, were burned and destroyed as the harbor of Rotterdam was bombed. Under Dutch control, Camp Westerbork was tolerable. My mother, father, brother, and I shared 2 small rooms. We all ate in a communal dining room, and at that time there was enough food for us so that we did not go hungry. Adults were assigned to various work duties. My father worked to repair shoes. My mother worked in the kitchen. We children had a makeshift education and lived a very dull, stagnant life. Several months later, when the Nazi SS took over the command of Westerbork, we became acquainted with the ever-present, terrifying 12-foot high barbed wire. And as thousands of Jews were rounded up, many taken from their hiding places, as was Anne Frank and her family, Camp Westerbork became overcrowded. And it was at that time that we had to share our small quarters with another family. And then the dreadful transports to the concentration and extermination camps in Eastern Europe began. This started in early 1942. And from then on, every Monday night, lists of those to be deported were posted, causing incredible anxiety, anguish, and fear. And then on Tuesday mornings, men, women, and little ones were marched to a nearby railroad platform from where they were transported. This area became known as Boulevard de Misère. It was an area of complete misery. At 11 o'clock on Tuesday mornings, the trains left for their destination. And of the total 120,000 men, women, and children that departed Westerbork, 102,000 were doomed never to return. In January of 1944, it was our turn to be shipped out. We children were actually glad for a change of environment. We were very naive and we welcomed the move. We were allowed to take 1 knapsack each, and whatever we could stuff into it, we were permitted to take. When we approached the railroad platform and we saw the cattle cars in which we were to travel, our fears began to mount. Adults suspected, and they somehow knew what was in store for us. I remember that it was a bitter cold, pitch black, rainy night when we arrived at our destination, concentration camp Bergen-Belsen in Germany. We were pulled and dragged out of the cattle cars and greeted by the German guards who were shouting at us and threatening us with their weapons and with the most vicious attack dogs by their sides. I was a very frightened 9-year-old. And to this day, I still feel a certain sense of fear whenever I see a German Shepherd. Bergen-Belsen was divided into various areas. It was sectioned off and surrounded by electrified barbed wire. Guards were always in strategically placed high guard towers, and in the evenings, as soon as it would turn dark, the bright searchlights from above would constantly sweep the campgrounds. We were placed in a section that was known as the Sternlager, or the Star Camp, named so because we had to continue wearing that yellow star, which had been issued to us back in Holland. Men were on one side of the camp and the women on the other. And this did make it possible at times for families to get a glimpse of one another. We were placed in this particular section of the camp with the hope of being exchanged for German nationals in Palestine, who the British put under house arrest because they were citizens of an enemy country. Unfortunately, this hope never materialized for our family. 600 of us, 600 of our people were crammed into each of the crude, wooden, heatless barracks meant for 100 when originally built. There were triple-decker bunk beds with 2 people sharing each bunk. German winters were bitter cold and very long. We were given only 1 thin blanket per bunk and a straw-filled mattress. And this bunk was our only living quarters, and that for 2 people. I was very lucky that I was able to share a bunk with my mother and that my brother was able to share a bunk with our father. But can you imagine two adults, two strangers sharing a bunk under such horrendous conditions? A bunk that was no larger than the small cot bed that we're all so familiar with. I remember the first time seeing a wagon filled with what I thought was firewood for the one small oven that we had in our barrack. That oven, of course, was never used. I soon realized that what was in the wagon were dead, naked bodies thrown one on top of the other. Toilets and so-called washing facilities were at a great distance in the most primitive outhouses. Toilets were long wooden benches with holes cut into them, one next to the other. There was no privacy, there was no toilet paper, there was no soap, and hardly ever any water with which to wash. And in the almost year and a half that we were in Bergen-Belsen, never once were we able to brush our teeth. There were no trees, no flowers, nor did we ever see a blade of grass. And whenever it rained, we had to slosh through the mud, adding even more misery to our already dismal existence. Every morning, every single morning, without fail, we were ordered to line up on a huge field. It was called an Appellplatz, 5 in a row as we were counted. We would have to stand there until each and every one of us was accounted for, often from early morning till late at night, without food, without water, no matter what the weather, without protective clothing. Frostbite was common. We would treat our affected toes and fingers with the warmth of our own urine. Our diet consisted of a slice of bread a day, some hot watery soup with grizzly meats and turnips and potato peels. Bread was later cut back and given to us just once a week, and only if our so-called quarters were neat and in order. Our birthday present to one another was that little piece of bread that we had saved up from the previous week. Once a month, we were marched to an area to shower, and there, under the watchful eyes of the guards, we were ordered to undress. We had heard about exterminations and gas chambers in other areas of Europe, and we therefore were never sure when the faucets were turned on as to what would come out, water or gas. The Nazis did their utmost to break us physically, spiritually, and emotionally. Unfortunately, they did succeed with many of our people. It was not uncommon for people who were no longer responsible for their actions to attempt escape, even though they knew that the chance to succeed was next to impossible. But they also felt that they had nothing more to lose. The failure of their attempts were obvious when we saw their lifeless bodies hanging electrocuted against the barbed wire. Malnutrition, dysentery, and the loss of the will to go on is what destroyed body and mind. Death was an everyday occurrence. The dark, crowded quarters often caused us to trip and fall over the dead. Bodies could not be taken away fast enough. We as children saw things that no one, no matter what the age, should ever have to see. I know, of course, that you have all heard, you've studied, you have read, you might have seen movies, perhaps even true documentaries about the Holocaust. But the constant foul odor, the filth, continuous horror and fear surrounded by death is indescribable. There is no way that this can be put accurately into words or pictures. Our bodies, hair, and clothes were infested with lice. We learned that there was a distinct difference between head lice and clothes lice. Squashing them between my thumbnails became my primary pastime. Much of my time was taken up with make-believe games, and one game, a game based on superstition, became very important to me. I decided that if I were to find four pebbles of about the same size and shape, that would mean that the four members of my family would all survive. My mother, my father, my brother, and I. It was a torturous, painful, very difficult game to play. What if I couldn't find a third or fourth pebble? Might that mean that one or two of my family members would not pull through? Nevertheless, this game gave me something to hold on to, some distant hope. After a number of months on our meager diets, our stomach shrunk so that the hunger was no longer painful. Teenagers and men suffered most from malnutrition and were the first to die. Those who lasted the longest were the women and mothers in particular. It was their strong will to keep their children alive that kept them going. And my mother was one of those remarkable ladies. There is no doubt in my mind that it was my mother's inner strength and fortitude that finally saw us through. One day, my mother was able to smuggle some potatoes and some salt from the kitchen where she worked, and somehow managed to cook some soup in secret. This was done on our bunk. I was on the bunk with her, trying to hide and shield what she was doing. Soup was simmering, just about finished, when the German guards entered our barrack for surprise inspection. In our rush to hide that setup, the boiling soup spilled on my leg. We had been taught self-discipline and self-control the hard way, for I knew for sure had I cried out, it would have cost us our lives. This happened in the spring of 1945. I was just 10 years old. The population in Camp Bergen-Belsen were dying off rapidly, but not nearly fast enough to satisfy the Nazis. Several weeks later, it was decided to send 3 trainloads of our people to Eastern Europe, towards the extermination camps and the gas chambers. We did not know that Auschwitz, with its gas chambers, had already been liberated. My family was among the 2,500 on the last of these 3 trains. It was April of 1945. Russian army was closing in from the northeast, and the British and the Americans from the west. Under normal conditions, this train ride from Bergen-Belsen to whatever area of Eastern Europe they're going to send us would have taken no more than 10 hours. But because the Germans were trying to evade the Allies, we were en route for 2 long weeks without food, without water, without medical supplies, without sanitary facilities. That meant no toilets. Whenever the train came to a stop, those who were able and those who were strong enough were permitted to get out and take a drink from a nearby stream or dig up roots to eat. My mother remembered taking some sort of a pot and collecting water from the locomotive, and who knows what else that pot was used for. The need for water at that time was almost more important than food because of the severe dehydration due to the dysentery and the high fever due to the typhus. Let me briefly explain typhus. It is a highly contagious, deadly disease that's caused from filth and spread by lice. At the same time, while the train was at a standstill, the newly dead were taken off and buried along the tracks. In addition, our train was subject to frequent air attacks by the Allies. It is truly remarkable how any one of us was able to survive under such horrendous conditions. In fact, 500 of our people, that's 1 out of every 5, died en route or shortly thereafter. My burnt leg was severely infected, and it was impossible to keep the wound clean or lice-free. In late April, after 14 days of this surreal and horrifying journey, the German guards stormed frantically through the train, seeking civilian clothing so that they would not be recognized by the Allies. And we knew then that the war was coming to an end. It was the Russian army that liberated our train and led us to a nearby farm village in eastern Germany. Most of the inhabitants had fled, and we took over their homes. Kitchens were stocked with ample food. It was rich and good, actually much too good for our starved bodies. We could not tolerate that unfamiliar nourishment. And at that time, at the age of 10 and a half, I weighed 16 kilos or 35 pounds, and my mother weighed a mere 70 pounds. That's about 35 kilos, I think. The Russians, in a crude way, tried to help us the best that they could. I was brought to a nearby clinic for medical attention. My leg was in very bad condition, and I was close to losing it. Fortunately, it was decided to treat the wound, and I was very lucky that my leg responded to medication and it gradually healed. As I regained my strength, I also relearned to walk. And in the interim, our heads were shaved because that was the only way that we could rid ourselves of head lice. Although we were all weak, ill, and thoroughly exhausted, I vividly remember the spring of 1945. The weather was beautiful, sunny and bright. Trees and grass were lush and green. Flowers were in bloom. Birds were singing. It was a wonderful, exciting feeling to be free at long last. We were all ill with typhus, but my father had to die from it 6 weeks after our liberation, and this after 6.5 years of mental torment and physical abuse. My 12-year-old brother Albert actually helped bury our father. When I talk about those years, it is as though I'm relating a nightmare, a very bad dream. I separate myself from it ever having happened to me, and that is how I deal with it. It is a wonderful story of how we gradually recuperated, were sent back to Holland to start our lives anew. My brother and I were eventually placed in the children's home, a youth aliyah home, in preparation to live in what was then British mandated Palestine, and we know today as Israel. Most of the children in this home survived alone without their parents. I felt like a total misfit. I needed to learn how to resettle into a normal society, had no training for that. Here I was by this time, 11 years old, had never been in a store, had no idea what money was all about, had almost no table manners. It was like learning to live all over again. It was in this home that we became reacquainted with life in its normal state. The meals served us were delicious and nourishing, and you can imagine that just about anything and everything tasted good to us. And though our surrogate parents provided a very strict environment, much love and care were given us. I began my first formal education at that time at the age of 11 and a half. We were taught the secular subjects, reading, writing, arithmetic, in a Montessori school where we progressed at our own pace. The Dutch language in which we were taught was all new to us. We also received a thorough education in Hebrew and in religious studies. The British, who were governing Palestine in the 1940s, had issued what was known as the White Papers, restricting the number of Jews permitted into the land. They were intercepting many of the refugee ships and interning the survivors on the island of Cyprus, and in some cases, turning the ships back to Europe. In November of 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine between Arabs and Jews, which in May of 1948 led to the establishment of the State of Israel. In 1947, just 1 year prior to Israel becoming a state, Our illegal voyage from Holland to Palestine was planned, and danger once again loomed over us. And because parents at that time were not permitted to accompany their children, my mother managed to make arrangements for a family of 3 to emigrate to the United States. And thanks to the Holland America line, we were able to use the tickets which had been purchased 10 years earlier. We arrived in Hoboken, New Jersey, April 23rd, 1948, by coincidence, exactly 3 years to the day of our liberation. It was a Jewish relief organization, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, that found a home for us in Peoria, Illinois. I had never heard of the state of Illinois, definitely not of the little town Peoria. And there, at the age of 13, I once again started life anew in a strange land and again learning a new language, my third new language in less than 3 years. First Dutch, then Hebrew, and now English. And because of my inability to speak English, I, at the age of 13, was placed in the 4th grade with 9-year-olds. Although both my brother and I worked long hours after school to help our mom pay bills, I nevertheless found time. I actually made time to take extra courses during the year, attend summer school, and by working very hard in my studies, I was able to be graduated from Peoria Central High School 5 years later at age 18, ranking 8th in a class of 267 students. It was 2 months after high school graduation that I was married to Nathaniel Lazan, who I had met at the age of 16 in Peoria. And we are so grateful to have celebrated our 67th wedding anniversary this past August. Nathaniel, come say hello to these nice people in Mexico. This is Nathaniel. Amazing, amazing, amazing person. He was an Air Force pilot, extremely conscientious and disciplined, and he's very good with his technology. Thank goodness I have him by my side in more reasons than one. I am grateful. I am very grateful that I survived healthy in body, mind, and spirit, and that together with my husband, I'm able to perpetuate my heritage with a wonderful family. We have 3 grown children, all 3 are happily married, and they've given us 9 beautiful grandchildren and 7 magnificent great-grandchildren. Amazing, amazing. And in March of 1996, my memoir, 4 Perfect Pebbles, co-authored by Lila Pearl, was published by Green Willow Division of HarperCollins. It is now in its 34th printing in hardback. And then HarperCollins decided to do a 20th anniversary edition. I don't know if you can see this. I definitely don't like this cover. It's got to be because of the barbed wire, but they were in charge, and I guess that was it. Has been translated into German, into Dutch, came out in Hebrew by Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Now they did a super job on it. And if you like, you may all read it in Japanese. Maybe there's someone here who can do just that. But above all, I am so grateful that the story is in book form so that it can be passed on to future generations. And I'm thrilled that a documentary has been made entitled Marion's Triumph with the actress Deborah Messing as the narrator. It's been aired over PBS stations throughout the country and in various other countries in the world these past number of years. So you see that despite all the terrible things that happened to me as a child, my life today is full and rewarding. Although I've spoken to upward of 1.5 million students and adults over these past 20-some years, it still has not become easy. However, I do realize the importance of sharing that period of our history with you. simply because in a few short years, we will not be here any longer to give a first-hand account. You, the students, it is your generation that is the very last generation that will hear these stories firsthand. And I therefore ask you to please share my story or any of the Holocaust stories that you read and hear about. Share them with your friends, share them with your relatives, and someday share them with your children. And yes, even with your grandchildren. When we are not here any longer, it is you who will have to bear witness. As difficult as it is, the horror of the Holocaust must be taught, must be studied, and kept alive. Only then can we guard it from ever happening again. This, can you see this?
Yes.
This is the very yellow star that I was forced to wear. It says Jude, which in German means Jew. It was just another way to denigrate us, to isolate us, and to set us apart from the rest of society. This represents a Star of David, a beautiful, meaningful Jewish symbol. But the Nazis made it so very ugly. Each of us, each and every one of us must do everything in our power to prevent such hatred, such destruction, and such terror from reoccurring. And we can begin by having love, respect, and tolerance towards one another, regardless of the religious belief, regardless of the color of our skin, regardless of the national origin. This respect towards one another must begin in our homes, around the kitchen table, the dining room table, wherever we gather as a family. We, the adults, must pass it on our places of business. You, the students, in your classrooms, in the university, your communities, the towns, the cities, and only if there's respect and tolerance towards one another in the countries can we expect to have peace in the world. We must begin with you, the students. We must begin with our children. Let us treat people as individuals. Let us look for similarities and respect the differences. Let us build bridges and reach out towards one another. And we must be true to ourselves and not blindly follow a leader without thinking ahead and searching our hearts and our minds as to what the consequences might be. It is not cool to follow just anyone's lead without first checking to see what his or her true intentions are. Please, please remember these messages. Share them with your friends who are unable to be with us this morning. Share them, remember them, but above all, let us all live by them. We're all aware, or we should be, that 6 million Jewish people were murdered during the Holocaust of the Second World War. The population of Ciudad de Mexico is approximately 9 million. Can you possibly imagine almost 2 out of 3 people in the city of Mexico wiped out? The 6 million also represent 1/3 of the entire pre-World War II Jewish population. Among them were 1.5 million children, children just like you. We also need to remember that there were 5 million non-Jews who lost their lives. Among them were the righteous Gentiles, as we refer to them, very, very special people, non-Jews who jeopardized their lives to save Jewish families. They would hide them in the attics. They would hide them in the basements. Farmers would hide them out in the barns. They were hidden in convents. And when these good people were caught doing what they felt was the right thing to do, they also were deported to concentration camps and in many cases lost their lives. And that brings me to another message. We must never generalize and judge an entire group by the actions of some within that group. These are all universal messages, messages that each and every one of us is familiar with to varying degrees, but need to be reminded of over and over again. And this certainly was a good opportunity to do so. These messages are the lessons learned from that dark period of our history, and certainly apply to today's world situation, and definitely to our own individual lives. By listening, I hope that you prevent our past from becoming your future. I now need to share something with you about a very, very dear, special lady, my mom. This was my mother on her 104th birthday. Mom passed, Mom passed away 6 weeks short of her 105th birthday. Amazing, amazing, wise, beautiful lady. There were two things that my mother demanded of my brother and me when we came to America. Number one, learn English, learn it quickly. Number two, work as hard as you can in school and at work in order to succeed. She was remarkable. She was 40 years old when we came to America, knew no English, learned to read, write, and speak a magnificent English. A remarkable lady, a remarkable mother-in-law to Nathaniel, and he was an outstanding son-in-law for sure. My brother passed away about 3.5 years ago, dealt with this altogether differently than I did. Did not talk about it as freely as you heard it from me this morning. Was happily married, lived in California, but by choice did not bring children into this world. Had a very difficult time with organized religion. All of that made me very sad, but I didn't fault Albert. We have to remember he was 2 years older than I am, was with my father in the men's section, and I am convinced that he saw and experienced things that I did not. God puts us on this earth, gives us a beautiful mind. It is this mind that allows us to choose right from wrong, good from evil. Therefore, men did this to one another. But did he have to make it so bitterly cold when we were standing out there on the Pell all day? I have a direct line. I ask loads of questions. Don't get too many answers, but that's okay. Faith I will always have. After all, here I am. 3 children, 9 grandchildren, 7 great-grandchildren from whom generations will be forthcoming. He made sure that enough of us survived so that we will always be here. I am proud of my faith, as I'm certain you're proud of your faith and of your heritage. But please, please, let us all remember to respect the right of others to their belief. Be kind and good and respectful and tolerant and compassionate towards one another. That is the basis for peace. Had there been respect and tolerance towards one another some 70, 80 years ago, I would not be with you this morning to share that dark period of our history with you. 9/11, September 11, 2001, would not have occurred. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, North Korea, all these countries that are in such turmoil would be peaceful countries for its people. Be kind and good and respectful towards one another, please. It is such a simple message and yet so difficult to achieve. There is very little that we can do against the negativity in our world, but how we treat, behave, and reach out towards one another, that is entirely up to us. Did I ever find my 4 pebbles? It's a frequently asked question. I always found my 4 pebbles. I made it my business to find them. I cheated all the time. When I found them, I put them in the safe place. Next time I would search for them and I couldn't find that 3rd one or that 4th one, well, I knew exactly where to go and pick them up. Maybe there was cheating, but it was my game, and guess who made the rules? You need to know that I was just about 9 or 10 years old when things were at its absolute worst. We had nothing to occupy our time with constructively. No paper, no pencils, no books, certainly no games. So I was lucky I had such an imaginative mind, and my imaginative games were always based on a positive attitude. I would search for a piece of glass or a piece of a mirror, whatever I could find on the dirt ground in Bergen-Belsen. And when the sun would shine, and that didn't happen nearly often enough in that part of Germany, known for bad weather and cloudy skies, but I, Marion, knew that that sun would always come out. And when it did, that little piece of glass would cast a reflection onto the ground. And that little wiggly reflection, it became my pet. As long as the sun would shine, I would have my pet, and my pet would never, ever die. I would also imagine that one day I once again would have my 3 Bs. And these 3 Bs represent our everyday comforts and necessities that we all take so much for granted. The first B represented a bed. I knew that someday I once again would have my very own bed with a real mattress, clean sheets, and enough blankets to keep me warm. Second B represented a bath, warm water, soap, clean towel, and with that would come toothpaste and a toothbrush, of course. And the third B was bread. I knew that someday I once again would have enough bread so that I would never again go hungry. These imaginative games, if you will, they were my survival techniques. They were my survival skills. Do you know that we all have survival techniques and skills within us? When the need arises, we just have to search for them, find them, and be sure that we put them to work. No one is spared adversity. No one is spared hardship. We all have to overcome obstacles at one time or another. But with perseverance, with determination, with faith, and above all, hope, one can overcome just about anything and everything. Above all, never, ever give up hope. It's not so much what happens to a person, it's how we deal with the situation that makes the difference. Nathaniel's from New York. He went to Bradley University in Peoria. Lucky me, because that's where I lived. And way back then in the 1950s, long distance telephone calls were very expensive. There were no computers, there were no texting, there was no emailing. But for at that time, for a 3-cent stamp, there really was such a thing as a 3-cent stamp. We would write to one another every single day. Major, major, major problems. In his letters to me, he would add 5 words that he asked me to define and put into a sentence. It's a lot of nerve with all I had to do, but I knew he meant to help me with my English, and I guess it did work. So I thank you, Nathaniel.
My pleasure, Marion.
And I, on the other hand, would write my letters in rough draft with a dictionary by my side. And only when I was satisfied with the way the letter was written would I dare mail it to him. Talking about a dictionary, my father always carried a little chunky German English dictionary with him, and he would study the vocabulary in secret whenever possible, always with the hope that someday he would reach America. When we came to the United States back in 1948 and approached New York Harbor, we were told the night before that if we wanted to see the Statue of Liberty, we needed to be on deck bright and early the next morning. Well, you can be sure that each and every one of us was on deck to greet and be greeted by that magnificent symbol of freedom, the freedom that had been denied us for so many years. And when that tall figure of that longed-for symbol appeared, I became too choked up to talk. So many emotions seized me at once: joy and gratitude, bitterness for the cruelties and that we and so many others had suffered, and deep, deep sadness that Papa, my father, could not share this moment with us. He would never know that we had reached America at last. And to this day, when we cross the Verrazano Bridge, let me explain the Verrazano Bridge in New York. It is a long bridge that connects the borough of Staten Island with that of Brooklyn. It spans the Hudson River. And the what? Whatever, it spans the river. And when we reach a certain point on that bridge, I will always crane my neck to see the Statue of Liberty. It's a most beautiful, meaningful, magnificent sight. We returned to Germany on various occasions. And the very first time that we went to Germany was back in 1995. It was the 50th anniversary of our liberation. And we visited my father's grave. And the reason my father and about 60 others have a private resting place in that farm village where we were liberated was because they died after some of the chaos had subsided. Those who died early on were all buried in mass graves. We also went to my former hometown of Hoya near Hanover, and they were greeted by public officials who apologized over and over again. And then there was a young non-Jewish couple born after the war that took us to the Jewish cemetery, and which was in terrible disarray, had not been cared for since 1938. And they took us to our family plot. And there, among the toppled over stones, was a brand new shiny granite footstone with the inscription, zur Erinnerung an die zerstörte Grabstelle der Familie Blumenthal, Hoya 1894 bis 1938. In memory of the desecrated plot of the Blumenthal family, Hoya 1894 to 1938, placed there by this non-Jewish young couple, unbeknownst to us. A most beautiful, generous, kind gesture. Never thought that I would refer to non-Jewish Germans in such glowing terms. And they became dear, dear, dear friends of ours.
It's people like this.
What, Nathaniel?
It's people like this.
And it's people like these that renew one's faith in humanity. Special, special people. And each time we return, and we've returned many times, and one of the times was 2010. Why? Because a brand new public high school in my former hometown was named in my honor. So now we have the Marion Blumenthal Oberschule in Hoya, a tremendous celebration, and I must say very, very courageous of this little town to redress what happened so many years ago in their midst. And the night before the celebration, we commemorated the night of broken glass on the site where our synagogue once stood. All difficult trips, but no regrets having returned. And you need to know that Germany is doing everything possible to continually remind their people as to what happened during that difficult, dark period of our history during the Holocaust. It's mandatory for the subject to be taught in their schools. And they have, for instance, in the parliament, murals depicting the night of broken glass. There are other areas that they came up with what's known as ein Stolperstein, a stumbling block. You don't stumble over it. It is a metal plaque deeply embedded in the sidewalk in front of the home where the person once lived and never returned. And on that plaque is his or her name, date of birth, where, when, and how he or she died. That's in front of the home. Hundreds and hundreds of plaques have been placed there in Germany and other countries as well. So they're doing everything possible to continually remind their people, and that has to be commended. And it's very difficult for the young people to continually hear about this, but they must hear about it to help and prevent this from ever happening again. Okay, I'll take a few questions and then I will wind down. Okay, Señora Francesca.
Yes, of course. ¿Hay alguien que quiere hacer alguna pregunta? Well, somebody asked if you had gone back to Germany, but that's already been answered. People are saying that they're very grateful for you having come here today with us. Somebody, Jose Esau, wrote, "It is really heartbroken to hear all what you've been through, but the way your resilience made you stronger to talk about this is amazing. All these words will definitely transcend and make history to improve this insensitive time we're currently facing. It is an honor for me to be here. Thank you." ¿Alguien más quisiera hacerle alguna pregunta? Oh, somebody wrote, how do you manage to forgive?
Okay, I'll never, ever forgive, but only those that are directly responsible, who were directly responsible. How can I forgive this? Those people who did this to innocent men, women, and children should have been made a head shorter right then and there. And it's such a difficult thing to comprehend that Germany, first of all, was one of the most cultured nations in the world at that time. And that these men and women were so cruel to their own citizens. And then they went home to their own families at night as though they had a 9-to-5 job. How can that be forgiven? They didn't just accidentally step on my toes.
Mm-hmm.
And can you imagine the millions and millions and millions of men, women, and children, both Jewish and non-Jewish, that were destroyed, and the generations that would have come from these 1.5 million children? Who knows? We might have eradicated cancer today or something. I mean, these are millions and millions of most likely brilliant people that were destroyed. That should be forgiven. But remember, only those that are directly responsible can never, never be forgiven.
Mm-hmm.
Not by me. And of course, you have no right to forgive because you went through this. But it must never, definitely never, ever be forgotten.
Okay.
So please.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. I hope I answered that question.
Yes,
Yes.
thank you. There's another question that says, do you really think evil is a choice? How can we forgive evil when we know humanity chose evil? And that's a little bit connected to what you have just said.
Humanity doesn't, you individual choose it. It's what you were brought up with. If you were brought up to resent and be intolerant to a certain group of people, then that's what you were taught to do. So, but everyone's got their own mind, and they should think for themselves and not just follow what they're told to do.
Uh-huh. And what's your relationship with other survivors?
Many of my dear friends who went through the war with me for 6.5 years, many did not survive. But I have one wonderful dear friend who lives in Jerusalem, and her name is Susie, and we connect with one another every couple of weeks. We will connect again April 23rd, our anniversary of liberation, always do. And not that we commiserate as to what happened so many years ago, but we have a special bond, a special connection, and it's a wonderful feeling to be with one another, even though it's long distance. We have children and grandchildren living in Israel, and before this COVID came about, we would visit there once or sometimes twice a year, and we would always visit with our friends at that time as well.
There's another question that says, what advice could you give us as young and thankfully privileged people to always keep working hard, keep loving, and not missing the most important things in life, such as family, despite us living in a world where everything is available to us?
I don't know what was the real question, though.
What advice could you give us as young and thankfully privileged people?
All right, no matter how privileged you are, just think about those people who are not as privileged as you are. Be kind towards one another, be compassionate towards one another. And we're also lucky to have this wonderful technology today But please, all of us, all of you, do not take this technology for granted. Use it for good only. Don't disparage others. Don't intimidate others. Do not embarrass your friends. Use this technology and social media and whatever else is involved in this technology for good only, please. There's so many good messages for us all to remember.
And support important causes.
Yeah. And look, where is this quote? I want to share a quote with you by the, what is his name? By the British statesman and philosopher. That pertains to what we were just talking about. His name was Edmund Burke. And he said, and I quote, "The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing." I'll repeat. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Please, please stay involved. You're young adults, you, the university students, be involved with worthwhile causes, please.
There's
I'll take 2 more questions.
Okay. Here's another one that says, how do you think that we can develop resilience in our children?
Through example, don't give in, don't give up. Have them understand how privileged they are to have what they have, no matter what it is. There are always people who have much less than they have. And I don't know, this is something that I hope the parents can instill on their children to appreciate what they have available to them. And what, Nathaniel?
You say not to what they don't have.
Yeah. This is true. We all have to be grateful for what we have and don't complain as to what we don't have. We're very quick to do that. Is kvetch about this and that and the other thing. We don't have this and complain. But just remember what you do have. It is wonderful. And above all, keep your health.
And value what you've got. The last question then asks about your relationship with God after living something like this.
Well, you heard me say that I have tumultuous feelings within me, definitely. I just like to think that he must have been crying also when he saw what his children were doing to one another. And
for sure,
he's with us, and it's wonderful to have faith. It gives you support, it gives you hope, it gives you something to hang on to, even during difficult times in one's lives. And no one is spared difficulties, for sure.
That's for sure. That's for sure.
But I want to thank you again, Senora Francesca, Senora Marcos, Senora Thelma, and your administration. Really, I so much appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak to your students. And I hope that one of these days I can come to your beautiful country and be with you in person. And I just want to wind down. September 11th, 2001. None of us will ever be allowed to forget that day. You, the students, were not even born yet. Most of you were not. At that time, Nathaniel and I were in Florida visiting children and grandchildren and speaking in schools. But because all planes were grounded, we chose to drive home. And as we approached New York and crossed the Verrazano Bridge that I mentioned earlier, amidst the smoking ruins of the Twin Towers, we could see the Statue of Liberty holding high the torch of freedom. It is that flame of freedom that the terrorists sought to destroy, but they could not, and they never will, because we will take good care of our freedom. We will safeguard our freedom. We will not and must not take our freedom for granted. Let us all, each and every one of us, redouble our efforts to be kind and good towards one another. And with that, I wish each and every one of you a healthy, happy, productive future in a world of love and peace. And gracias again for giving me the opportunity to be with all of you. And all consider yourself hugged by me, please. And I wish each and every one of you well, your children, grandchildren, all succeeding generations. Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marion, really, thank you. Thank you very much. After listening to you, I have really no words. Thank you for your life, for your testimony. You contagious hope, strength. You are really an example that evil doesn't have the last word. It is up to each and every one of us to build a better future. Thank you really for your life and to share with us your life, really. A big hug.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I wanted to say that most of the students that have been posting things on the chat have also thanked you thoroughly for your amazing speech and for the example of resilience that you have given us today. Thank you very much, Marion.
Thank you. If I reached one person in your audience, it'll have been very worth for our connecting with one another. Thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. See you soon.
Yes, thanks so much.
Adiós.
Adios.
Adiós. Adiós. Bien.
Pues muchas gracias a todos los que nos acompañaron. Thank you, Marion. You're so inspiring. Thank you very much. Y bonito día a todos. Gracias. Gracias, Maru. Gracias, Francesca.
Gracias a todos. Bye,
Gracias a
Marion.
Luzma y gracias a los técnicos que nos ayudaron.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, Marion.
And continue success and good luck. Okay, in a COVID-free world, please.
Yes.
Okay.
Take care of yourself.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you to all of you. Many thanks. Thank you.
Bye.
Pues muchas gracias, Pablo. Muchas gracias, Luzma. Pues ya, muchas gracias.
Por nada, Telma. Cuídate. Creo que ya quedó. Muchísimas gracias.
Ok, hasta luego.
Bye.